Tonight's speaker will be the 46th in the series, and I think one of the most distinguished we've had. David Kennedy is probably on anyone's short list as one of the top historians in the United States. And as a director of the Institute, you need to find creative ways to lure high-profile speakers to campus. You need to think really creatively. So David and I had some early email contact on another project, and I learned that he had spent an impressionable short period of time in Du Quoin. On his way to graduate school at Yale, he left the West Coast, and on his way to Yale, he got detoured in Du Quoin. Of course, there was a young lady involved. So he'd had this wonderful couple days in Du Quoin. So I said, if you come to the Institute, I promise you, my wife and I will take you to Du Quoin for lunch. And we did that today, beautiful sunny fall day. It was remarkable, and we had a great lunch, and then we maybe broke a few rules and snuck on the fairgrounds and drove around and actually found one of the mansions that he had stayed at during his visit here. So hopefully that brought back good memories. But as I said, David Kennedy is one of the best historians in the business, and he bridges the worlds of popular history and also rigorous scholarship. He won the Pulitzer Prize for his history of the Depression and World War II, which is I think, one of the great American history books I've ever read. It's just an absolute marvel of great scholarship and clear and vigorous writing. And I would invite all of you to read the book. It's 900 pages, so it'll take. That's how I spent my summer vacation, reading it. But it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And in addition to that, David has written a great book called Over Here, The First World War and American Society, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and then wrote a book called Birth Control in America, The Career of Margaret Sanger, which won the Bancroft Prize, which is one of the most distinguished prizes in historical writing. And has also been active in a documentary that he did with Condoleezza Rice called American Creed that has stimulated some spirited conversations on American identity and American life. So with that, I'd like to introduce David Kennedy.
Thank you very much, John. I can honestly say that of all the introductions I've received in my lifetime, that was without question the most recent. So thank you very much. So I want to begin with a little bit of a personal story that will strike you as having nothing to do with my main subject this evening, which is World War II. But several years ago, I was on a bicycle trip down the California Big Sur coast. If any of you have ever been on the Big Sur coast, you know what I'm talking about. It's one of the most scenic places in North America, and there's an annual ride that starts in Carmel, the north end of the coast, and goes down to Cambria at the south end of the coast. And it was the first time I'd been on this ride, and I didn't know anybody virtually in the whole group of 100 and some riders. So we were all milling around the parking lot of a motel in Carmel at about 6 o'clock in the morning. You have to imagine the scene. It's foggy, kind of cold, and a bunch of middle-aged people in spandex getting ready to go down the coastal road. And this fellow came up to me and introduced himself, and he said, my name's Jack McGlynn. I haven't seen you on this ride before, but welcome to have you here. I'm a lawyer in San Francisco. How about you? I said, well, happy to meet you, Jack. My name's David Kennedy, and I teach history at Stanford University. He said, oh, I know all about you guys. He said, you historians, he said, all you do is you make up these what-if scenarios. What if this had happened? How would things be different? What if this had not happened? How would the course of events played out differently? Well, you might imagine, I thought that was a pretty reductionist description of my life's work. So before I had a chance to formulate anything that even vaguely resembled a cogent answer to him, he said, well, I've got one for you, and you could hear the little inner voice, Mr. Smarty Pants Professor, I've got one for you. He said, what if, on November 22nd, 1963, it had been not John F. Kennedy who fell to the assassin's bullet, but instead Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, had been assassinated on that day? How would the subsequent course of history have been different? Well, as you might imagine, I had never thought of that scenario before that moment. So again, I was fumbling for an answer, and of course he came right back and said, well, I'll tell you. He said, we can say one thing with absolute certainty, if that were the case, if it were Khrushchev and not Kennedy who were killed on that day, Aristotle Onassis would not have married Mrs. Khrushchev. Now, you've just demonstrated something for me, and that is that humor is generationally conditioned and specific. Because the people in the back of the room, I can tell, are looking in great puzzlement. What the devil is he talking about? If you don't have a mental picture of Nikita Khrushchev and Mrs. Khrushchev, you just don't get it. So when I try to tell that to my Stanford students, they just look at me absolutely blankly, and I've given up telling it in the classroom, but thank you for understanding. All right. Jack McGlynn, actually, that guy that pulled that thing on me, actually had a point, that historians do sometimes explicitly, more often implicitly, ask what-if style questions. We're not laboratory scientists. We can't rerun a historical event at the laboratory bench and add a reagent or subtract an element and see how the reaction goes differently. We can't do that. So we often do it as a kind of thought exercise to ask what-if style questions. So here's a question I'd like to pursue with you here this afternoon. What if the United States had lost the Second World War? How would the world that we've all lived in ever since look different? Now, that's a pretty robust and raw form of the question, so let's refine it a little bit and ask, what if the United States had emerged on the victorious side of the war, but had fought on a different strategic basis and on a different timetable, and with a different configuration of forces and different emphases in the various theaters of the war? How would the conclusion or the position of the United States at home and abroad been different at the end of the conflict? Now, it's a complicated question. I'm going to try to unpack it for you. But there's a premise that underlies these remarks, and the premise is that World War II was an enormously transformative event in the history of this society and indeed in the history of the world. And there's a proposition that I want to argue, I hope I can convince you that I'm on the right track, that the transformative effects of the war did not just happen as a kind of incident of this god-awful conflict, but were really part of a very shrewdly calculated and carefully implemented grand strategy on the part of the United States. Now, that's not the usual way that one thinks about this conflict, but that's the argument I'm going to try to make. So, how transformative was the war? And here, just to put you in the mood a little bit, we'll just look at a few iconic images of the war. Of course, this is where it all begins for the United States. It's not where the war begins, but where it began for the United States in Hawaii on December 7th, 1941. There's the monument that sits above the sunken hull of the USS Arizona that you saw in flames in the previous slide. There's the monument from the air. If you look carefully, you can see the shadow of the ghost of the sunken Arizona below the monument. And here is the headline announcing the end of the war in Europe. It was several months later, of course, before the war ended in Asia or in the Pacific. This is a crowd celebrating the German surrender on May 8th, 1945 in Times Square, a photograph I liked so much I used it for the cover of my book, Freedom from Fear. This is, of course, the end of the Pacific War with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These are troops or people celebrating the end of the war, again, with the end of the war in the Pacific, the end of the whole conflict, essentially. Another iconic photograph from that era. I put question marks after these names because even down to the present day, we're not 100% sure of who these people were that did the famous kiss in Times Square. And I'll come back to these fellows in just a minute. So how transformative was the war? I'll take as my text two documents. One is a passage in one of the early pages of Philip Roth's great novel, American Pastoral, where he tries to make the reader understand what was the mood of the United States in the immediate post-war, post-1945 period. And there's a sentence in there that I thought was really quite shrewdly put. He said it was the greatest moment of collective inebriation in all of American history. That the country was giddy with a sense of success, of moral purpose, of having been on the right side of a good war, if there is such a thing, and the country was filled with national self-confidence, so much so that I think it's not any kind of coincidence or accident that it is in that post-World War II moment that this nation finally had the political will to grasp the nettle of the most nettlesome problem in our history, was the problem of racial equality, and the civil rights movement happens in the context of that highly self-confident post-World War II moment in time. So that's one thing to recollect, is just how giddy with self-confidence this country was in that generation following World War II. I'll take as my other text a sentence that appears in Winston Churchill's memoir of the war, where he describes the moment when he heard the news of the Pearl Harbor attack. And he then gave an address later in 1945 on the floor of Parliament. She also is all in his papers, of course, where he describes on August 15th, 1945, the Japanese emperor had just signaled Japan's intention to surrender, which happens formally about 2 weeks later on the deck of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. But in this speech in Parliament, Churchill, no longer the Prime Minister, but still in Parliament, gave a uncharacteristically brief speech in which he tried to sum up for his fellow countrymen and others what he thought would be the consequences of this great conflict that was now ended. And there's a sentence in that speech that jumped right off the page of me when I first read it. He said, it's a very simple declarative sentence, and he uses a form of diction that has long since gone out of usage in American English, but was, at least at his time, still common in British English. He rendered the United States as a plural noun. And the sentence is quite simple. He says, in 1945, he said, the United States stand at this moment at the summit of the world. Now, that was a short, descriptive sentence, but absolutely accurate, and I would argue that in some degree, we have to qualify for all the intervening history, of course, but in some degree, a version of that statement has been accurate ever since, that the United States has had hegemonic weight in the international system ever since 1945. Now, the thing that strikes me as an historian about that sentence of Churchill's in 1945 is how improbable that kind of a statement would have been just 5 years earlier in 1940. So let's just revisit 1940 for a minute. 1940 is the last full peacetime year in the United States. The war in Asia is already 3 years old at least, since 1937, the Japanese invasion of the Yangtze Valley. It's more than a year old in Europe, which the war begins in 1939, of course, in Europe. So 1940 is the last full peacetime year. The United States is not a belligerent. And in that year, it was the 11th year of the Great Depression. More than a decade had gone by when this country had suffered through the most protracted and deepest economic crisis in all of its history. Right, that's still true right down to the present day. We think that the federal government did not keep poverty statistics at that time the way it has since the 1960s, but we reconstructed poverty levels in 1940 using those latter day developed techniques. And we think that in 1940, 45% of all white households and 95% of all African-American households lived below the poverty line in 1940. Now, that's some bit of testimony to just how deep and pervasive the effects of the Great Depression were that had gone on since 1929 or 1930. And if we look to if you look this 5 years over the horizon of the future from 1940, this country enters on a period of economic growth that is essentially uninterrupted down into some date indeterminate, maybe in the 1960s or early 1970s, when we doubled the size of the middle class as measured by incidence of home ownership in the 15 years between 1945 and 1960, an extraordinary period of robust and widely spread prosperity. And if we look to the international order and ask what the world looks like in 1940, the contrast with what's coming is even more dramatic. So in 1940, the United States had, within the memory of many or most living adults, had refused to join the League of Nations in 1918, 1919, 1920, even though the League was the product of an American president's planning, Woodrow Wilson's. The United States had enacted the most prohibitive tariffs in its history, the notorious Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930 in particular. It had, for the first time in its history, imposed a numerical cap on immigration in the notorious National Origins Act of 1924. It had insisted on the repayment to the United States Treasury of loans made during the war to particularly the treasuries of Britain and France. And in the 1930s, the United States Congress had passed no fewer than 5 formal neutrality statutes intended to keep the United States out of any future conflict that looked like World War I. So you name the metric or the dimension, whether it's political or diplomatic or moral or economic or what have you, the United States in 1940 was at about the most isolationist moment in all of its history. Now, if you'd walk down the street of a great American city like DuQuoin or Carbondale in 1940, and you'd heard a street corner speaker out there up on his soapbox saying something like, "My fellow citizens, in this year of grace, 1940, I'm here to tell you that this economically stricken country of ours, unable to escape from the so-called Great Depression for the last decade, is about to enter into a period of economic growth that will double the size of our middle class by 1960, and we will be identified as the most economically successful and prosperous country, not only on the planet, but in all of human history. And what's more, my fellow citizens," our speaker goes on, "this isolationist country of ours, which refused to join the League of Nations, which erected the highest tariff barriers in its history, which passed these neutrality statutes in the last decade, we will step forward as the leader of a wholly remade international system with new institutions in it. One of them will be called the United Nations, one will be called the International Monetary Fund, another will be called the World Bank, yet another will be called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which will morph into something called the World Trade Organization by the end of the century. And by the end of the century, in fact, the transformations, American-led, in the international system will be so pervasive that we will have invented a term to describe it, and the word will be globalization." Now, anybody who had predicted that in 1940 would have been certifiably deemed to be crazy and hauled off, never to be heard from again. But we know that those are exactly the things that happen because we get to see things illuminated by the fabled stern lantern of history. So, how did that happen? How did those improbable results, both at home and internationally, come about between 1940 and 1945? Well, the intervening event, of course, between 1940 and 1945 is World War II and this country's entry into it. So that's what I want to look at in some detail. Now, my students at Stanford, sometimes if I get them to speak candidly about how they feel about the study of history, they've been known more than once to say to me something like, "You know, Professor Kennedy, the trouble with the study of history is it's just one damn thing after another." So if you take nothing else away from this discussion today, I hope it will be a sense that the transformations, I use that word again, that this country experienced and led the world to experience in the post-1945 period is not a case of just one damn thing after another. It's a case of one very deliberately crafted and pursued grand strategy, and that's my big subject. Okay, so I've got us down more or less to the point where the United States enters the war, 1941. So let's just dwell on that moment, December 1941, just for a bit. I've put the photographs of some of the major players in this great conflict up here, and I want to share with you some remarks of some of these people, 4 of them, about what the implications were of America entering the war on December 7th, actually formally December 8th, 1941. So the first remark, we have an ear witness to what Adolf Hitler said when he heard the news of the Pearl Harbor attack. This has been reported and well documented that he said the following: "Now it is impossible for us to lose the war. We now have an ally, Japan, who has never been vanquished in 3,000 years." So Hitler's first reaction to the Pearl Harbor attack is to be filled with energy and confidence and exhilaration that now German victory is assured. And what we're permitted to believe is essentially, for all practical purposes, the same moment in time. It can't have been different by more than a few hours, Winston Churchill hears the same name, same news, in the same way that Hitler heard it over the news wires. Believe me, Churchill did not have any prior knowledge about the Pearl Harbor attack, contrary to a lot of conspiratorial thinking. And we don't know what he said, but we do know what he wrote in that famous 5-volume history of the war that he wrote after. And he tries to make the reader understand what was his state of mind when he hears the news of Pearl Harbor, and he wrote the following. He said, "So the United States was in the war, up to the neck and into the death," good Churchillian prose. "So we had won after all. England would live. I went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and the thankful." Now, there's a couple of things to be noted about that remark. It was more than a little disingenuous. Maybe we might have an opportunity to come back to that particular point later. But the other thing to note about it is here we have, for all practical purposes, the same moment in time, Hitler and Churchill locked in mortal combat for the fate of Europe and the world, the great adversaries of World War II, making precisely 180-degree appraisals of what will be the implications of American belligerency. Hitler is filled with confidence. Churchill is filled with confidence in the other direction. This assures British victory. Hitler thinks it assures German victory. The point here, again, from an historical point of view, is this reminds us how uncertain it was at this late date in December of 1941 exactly how, where, when, and with what configuration of forces the United States would actually become a formal belligerent. Okay, two other remarks that are pertinent to this general point. The next one comes from there's Hitler, of course, there's Churchill. The next remark comes from the pen of this man, Joachim von Ribbentrop, who was the German foreign minister. Here he is portrayed in his SS uniform. So after Hitler had somewhat gratuitously declared war on the United States on December 11th, something he was not treaty bound to do in terms of his treaty with Japan, but he declared war on the United States, and so Ribbentrop prepared a memo for his Fuhrer about what he thought would be the implications of the fact that the United States was now in the war and Germany and the United States were at war with one another. And it's a long, detailed, very cogently argued memo, but here's the essence of it in a couple of sentences. Ribbentrop says to Hitler in mid-December 1941, he says, "We have just 1 year to cut Russia off from her military supplies." So the Germans had invaded Russia in June of 1941. "If we don't succeed, and the munitions potential of the United States joins up with the manpower potential of the Russians, the war will enter a phase in which we shall only be able to win it with difficulty." Now, there was a much more sober and analytically accurate appraisal of what would be the implications of American belligerency. Ribbentrop got it right, Hitler got it wrong, that the United States would, if the war lasted long enough, the United States could bring to bear an amount of material that would be, and financial help and so on and so forth, that would be absolutely insuperable to overcome on the part of the Axis powers. Final remark that I want to share with you comes from the pen of this man, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who was the chief of the Japanese Imperial Fleet. Pictured on the right are the men who shot down his plane over Bougainville in 1943 and killed him. But he had studied in the United States, he'd studied at Harvard, he traveled in the United States, he knew this country well. And here is what he wrote to the last peacetime prime minister in Japan, Fumimaro Konoye, in September of 1940. So I'm breaking the time frame of December 1941 here, I hope for legitimate reasons. So September 1940, the Japanese-American relationship is starting to go seriously south, and Yamamoto wrote the following to Prime Minister Konoye. He said, "If I am told to fight regardless of the consequences," this is the man who is going to be told to plan the Pearl Harbor attack. He said, "If I am told to fight regardless of the consequences, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year." Note the time frame almost identical to Ribbentrop's. "But I have utterly no confidence for a second or third year. And I hope, therefore, Mr. Prime Minister, that you will endeavor to avoid a Japanese-American war." Now, again, a very interesting document because here's Yamamoto, who was given the responsibility several months later of planning the attack, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that will bring the United States once and for all into the war, advising his government not to do it. Now, it seems to me that Ribbentrop and Yamamoto knew something that apparently Hitler didn't. It's the first rule of warfare articulated thousands of years ago by the great Japanese theorist Sun Tzu. And that the first principle of warfare, said Sun Tzu, is know your enemy. And what Yamamoto and Ribbentrop knew about the United States was that if it had time, it could mobilize resources, material resources, at a level and at volume that would smother any possible combination of adversaries, including the Axis powers. Franklin Roosevelt, in his own roundabout way, it seems to me, acknowledged the same thing in that famous fireside chat where he said in December of 1940, he said, "We shall become the great arsenal of democracy." Note what he did not say. He did not say we'll become the sword of democracy. He didn't even say we'll become the shield of democracy. He said we'll become the great arsenal of democracy. And that, if my general argument here can be summed up in one word, it is that word arsenal. And I'll try to develop this a little bit further for you by telling a little tale, a parable, that I'm going to call A Tale of Three Cities, how the United States fought World War II. So the first city I'm going to talk about is all these three cities. This is just a pedagogical device, you might say, a way to organize our thinking. This is not, you don't find this in the standard textbooks about the war, but it's just a way to understand what American grand strategy looked like. If we understand what happened in these three cities, we'll understand the big pattern of American grand strategy and how, to quote Churchill again, how the United States got deposited at the summit of the world in 1945. The three cities I'm going to talk about, what they have in common, among other things, each is located on a river. And the first city is located on the Seine River in France, Rouen, France, and the date of this chapter in our little parable is August 17th, 1942. Now that's not a date that's emblazoned in our collective memory like 9/11 or November 22nd, 1963 or December 7th, 1941. So why is this important? On this date, August 17th, 1942, a squadron of exactly 12 B-17 bombers, there's some B-17s there, those actually might be, no, those are B-17s, took off from their air base in the south of England, and they flew across the English Channel, escorted by a swarm of British Spitfire fighters, even though the B-17s were supposed to be self-defending. They didn't need fighter escort, but they had it anyway. And they bombed a railroad marshalling yard, which is, you can see in this photograph here, in Rouen, France. And by some metrics, this was a highly successful raid. All the ordnance was dropped on the primary target, which didn't always happen. There was no loss of crew, no damage to aircraft. Planes all returned to base, and it was a great success at a tactical level. That's not why it intrigues me here. The reason I bring this up as a chapter in this parable about three cities that tell us how the United States fought the war is that on this date, August 17th, 1942, we see the implementation of a strategic doctrine that had been articulated almost exactly a decade earlier in the early 1930s, when American military planners, having read and studied a book by an Italian military theorist by the name of Giulio Douhet, a book called The Command of the Air. Douhet had argued that there was a new technology, namely the airplane, that promised to revolutionize the nature of warfare. If the airplane were used correctly, argued Douhet, it would change the nature of warfare, and it would particularly advantage societies like the United States that had gigantic industrial bases and lots of engineering and scientific manpower. And the idea was not to use the aircraft for tactical support of troops on the ground, that's called tactical air, but to use it in a strategic way, and the doctrine that comes out of this is called strategic bombing. And the idea of strategic bombing is that you deliver your blow not against the enemy's armed forces, but against his homeland, and you try to so destroy his industrial capacity and his industrial infrastructure, communications, transportation infrastructure, that he will lose his capacity to support his army in the field. And no apologies made by Giulio Douhet, the other parallel purpose of strategic bombing was, I'll use his word, to terrorize the enemy's civilian population by attack from the air, so that the civilian population would lose its will to fight, press the enemy's government to sue for peace. American planners read this, took it on board in the early 30s, and the decision was made. Should the United States be involved in a future conflict, the major emphasis of the American military establishment would be to develop a strategic air arm. This would spare American lives. It would avoid the kind of trench warfare that was so god-awful in World War I. It would leverage the great advantages the United States had in production capacity and in scientific and engineering know-how, and it would be a way to end the war quickly on a relatively cost-free basis. So the United States goes ahead, plans slowly, but the production levels gradually picked up to phenomenal levels, and made its principal bet in its military configuration on the strategic air arm. Note the date of this air raid. It's the first all-American raid on Nazi-occupied Europe, August 17th, 1942. This is almost 2 years before D-Day. And here's another interesting detail about this. The pilot of the lead aircraft on that August 17th, 1942 raid was the man I've highlighted here, pointed out with the yellow arrow, and if you didn't recognize him, there's his name, Paul Tibbets. Those of you who got the Khrushchev story will recognize the name. Paul Tibbets is the pilot of the Enola Gay. Almost exactly 3 years later, the plane that drops the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. So poetically enough, if it's proper to say poetically, in this one man's career in World War II, we have a kind of summary statement about the importance of air power in the American war effort. He opens the front, the strategic bombing front against Germany in 1942, and he closes the war essentially with the atomic attack on Hiroshima on August 5th, 1942. Just about 3 years later to the week is when, August 6th, 1945, when the Hiroshima attack happened. So this is chapter 1. It reminds us that the United States chose by a deliberate decision to place its principal bet in the whole panoply of armed forces that it could muster on the strategic air arm. All right, chapter 2. Much less dramatic, but still quite consequential. This has to do with a meeting held in the office of this man here in the center. His name was Donald Nelson, not a name that's a household word today. Before the war, he had been the CEO of Sears Roebuck, another word that's passing out of currency. And he was one of these $1-a-year men who came to Washington, D.C. to help organize the war effort, and he was the head of something called the War Production Board. And his assignment, the War Production Board's assignment, was to shift the American economy from a peacetime to a wartime footing, and to shift resources from the civilian economy to the military sector, and to supply the military with the goods it needed to wage the war. And the military had a plan. The plan had a name. It was actually a document called the Victory Program with capital V, capital P. The plan had been drawn up in the War Plans Department in the War Office, the Office of the Secretary of War, in 1941 by a general by name, then a colonel named Albert Wedemeyer. And it was an enormously detailed document that was the product of lots of study by actuaries and economists and engineers and so on, right down to how many chainsaws would be needed to cut down how many board feet of lumber to build the barracks, to house how many soldiers and sailors and airmen, and how much wool would be needed for their uniforms and cotton for the uniforms, and how many rifles and machine guns and tanks and bullets. The total was over 40 billion bullets. And this was the document that Donald Nelson was instructed to operationalize, to realize the goals set out in this program. As 1942 rolled on, this man on the right, pictured here several years later, receiving the Nobel Prize in Economics, Simon Kuznets, who was on Donald Nelson's staff, and Kuznets started to argue, as 1942 rolled out, that achieving the goals that Nelson was tasked with achieving in the Victory Program was not feasible. So this became known internally as the feasibility dispute, and a very important chapter in the history of this country's engagement in World War II, and one that is totally lost to our collective memory, but very, very important. So Kuznets argued, and the economists on his staff argued, that if the United States proceeded at the pace it was trying to proceed to shift from a civilian to a military basis in the economy, it would severely crimp civilian standards of living and shrink the civilian sector of the economy in ways, Kuznets suggested, might seriously deplete the American public's appetite to continue pressing the war. So he argued that the pace of mobilization had to be slowed down, and the volume of mobilization, the degree of mobilization, also had to be scaled back. So they had a fateful meeting on October 5th, 1942, in the office of Donald Nelson. Here, this is not a photograph of that meeting, but there he is. They had a fateful meeting on October 5th, 1942, in which the subject was, can we still afford to go ahead with the level and pace of mobilization that we've been pursuing? The White House was represented at this meeting by Vice President Henry Wallace, and the decision, much against the grain of the military, was no, we cannot, it's not feasible to go ahead at the rate we've been going. And two big, important decisions flowed out of that recognition. Number one, the target date for the event that we know as D-Day, the great amphibious crossing of the English Channel and the invasion of Northwest Europe, was postponed by a year. The original target date was July 1st, 1943, and as we know, it happened on June 6, 1944. So effectively 1 year delay in the opening of the so-called Second Front, the event we know as D-Day. That was number one. The second decision was to scale back the size of the ground force that was originally conceived to be 215 divisions of infantry and support, and that was scaled back to 90 divisions. So 125 divisions worth of manpower that had originally been targeted for induction into the armed forces and training and deployment overseas was left behind to work in the industries of the arsenal of democracy. Now, the military were very nervous about this, and inside the military, the term for especially that second decision to scale back from 215 to just 90 divisions, they called that the 90 division gamble. And why did they think it was a gamble? Well, that takes us to chapter 3 of our story, which is Stalingrad in 1940, where the Battle of Stalingrad concludes in February of 1943. If there was a battle, any single battle in World War II that could claim the status of the turning point of the war, it would be Stalingrad. Now, frankly, I don't think it's really proper to even think in those terms about a single turning point of the war, but if you want to think of it that way, it has to be Stalingrad. Stalingrad, of course, is deep inside the Soviet Union. The German Wehrmacht had penetrated deeply into the Soviet Union and was finally stopped on the banks of the Volga River in Stalingrad. When John F. Kennedy, in his speech at American University in June of 1963, tried to make his audience understand what the Russians had gone through in World War II, he told his audience, which presumably didn't know this ahead of time, that the German invasion of Russia and the destruction it wrought would have been equivalent in the United States to the razing of every single industrial facility between Chicago and the Atlantic seaboard. So this is deep, deep inside the Soviet Union, but finally here the German advance is stopped. The Red Army switches from defensive posture to offensive posture and begins the process of driving the Germans back out through central Russia, the Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and back into the streets of Berlin by the spring of 1945. Now I think this is probably a colored, later colorized photograph. I think there are very few, if any, actual color photographs of Stalingrad, but here we finally arrive at D-Day. And again, let me just remind you of something. D-Day happens a year later than it was originally scheduled to happen. It happens on June 6, 1944. It's a major and much mythologized event in American history, but this is just 11 months before the end of the European War. And the European War was 5 years old, almost 5 years old, by the time the United States lands on the Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944. So here's the real secret or explanation of how the United States put its weight in the scales to win the war. It's not by ground fighting principally, but principally by air attacks on Germany starting in 1942, and then on Japan later in the war, of course, and by these enormous quantities of industrial production. When Stalin met Roosevelt for the first time face-to-face at Tehran in Iran in 1943, Stalin, in a face-to-face, one-on-one meeting with Roosevelt, said, through their translators. There were only 4 people in the room, 2 translators and the 2 principals. And Stalin said to Franklin Roosevelt's face, he said, "It seems that you Americans have decided to fight this war with American money and American machines and Russian men." And that was a very cynical, hard-bitten, characteristically Stalin-esque way to describe it, but it's an all too accurate description of what was the greater geometry of the various countries' contribution to the eventual war effort. So if you ask the question, who won World War II? Depending on what exactly you mean by that question, you get a different answer. If you mean who emerged at the end of the conflict in the most advantageous position, it is clearly the United States. But if you mean what society paid the greatest price in blood and treasure and destruction for the eventual victory, especially over the Nazis, it is clearly the Soviet Union. I'll come back to that point as well. All right, so who won the war? Here's, again, I'll just go through these quickly, just a reminder of just how prodigious was what at the time was called the production miracle of the American economy in World War II. So just, you name the element of war and the instrument of war, and we made lots of them. Here's ship production at the Richmond shipyard, for example, over 1 year. And then we get to this. Because there's a relationship between the way the United States fielded its military and shaped its military, especially the ground forces, and what was happening at home in the civilian economic sector. Of all the major belligerents in World War II, by major belligerents I mean the United States, Britain, and China, Russia, Germany, Italy, briefly, of course. But of all the major belligerents, in every single other belligerent society, the civilian sector of their societies or their economies shrank markedly during the war. Our two allies, Western allies in the Grand Alliance, Soviet Union and Great Britain, we have good data from there, and our conclusion is that the civilian economies in both Britain and the Soviet Union shrank by about 1/3. So people had 1/3 less fuel, food, shelter, clothing, housing, whatever, that the civilian economy traditionally provided. In the United States and the United States alone, the civilian sector of the economy in wartime grew by 15%. Civilians at home in the United States were better off during the war than they had been in the pre-war years. There's no other society that fought this war, the Great War, about whom that could be said. And here's one way to remember it. This is Macy's department store in New York, 1944. So toward the end of 1944, the marketing team, or I don't know, the executive suite people at Macy's decided, well, we're going to have a store-wide sale, a discount sale, the kind of things that retailers do routinely. And so the question is, when should we have it? What date? And the date they chose, this is one of these only in America stories, it was December 7th, 1944, the third anniversary of Pearl Harbor. Now, I don't know about you, but if Walmart or somebody decided to have a sale and call it a 9/11 sale to commemorate the anniversary of 9/11, I think most of us would find that pretty creepy. But that's what they did, December 7th, 1944. This is just a few days before the Battle of the Bulge in Europe. It's about the time of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the invasion of the Philippines and the Pacific. It's just about the time of the most severe, costly fighting that the United States engaged in both the Pacific and European theaters. But they had the sale, December 7th, 1944. And at the end of the day, they rang up all the receipts. And it turned out on that day, Macy's department store had a higher dollar volume of sales than of any day in its history, down to that moment. There is no other society that fought World War II where you could say something like that. And it's another reminder that this country's war was different from everybody else's war, not least of all because we decided to fight late, principally from the air, with a smaller force than originally intentioned, and the time that was bought for this country to mobilize its resources to those levels in fighting that way was time largely bought by the Soviet Union. So I'll head toward a conclusion here with some pretty grisly numbers about number of deaths in the war. We think World War II may well have been the first war, certainly the first war in modern history, where the civilian death toll is actually greater than the military death toll. because of the kinds of disruptions that occurred that were inflicted on civilian societies by military activity and by strategic bombing. So you can see here, this chart actually is not as accurate as it ought to be, and I should have revised it for this occasion, but I didn't, so bear with me. But you'll see military and civilian deaths. So I'll just give you some numbers, and the numbers I'm going to give you are slightly different from what you see there, but the orders of magnitude are the same. So the United Kingdom, our first ally in the so-called Grand Alliance, society about roughly 1/4 our size, 350,000 dead, of whom 100,000 roughly were civilians. China, we think somewhere in the range of, here the numbers are less reliable because China was so disrupted in wartime that a lot of records weren't properly kept, but we think that somewhere between 10 and 12 million Chinese perished in World War II, about 6 million of whom were civilians. Yugoslavia, we think a relatively small country by American standards, 2 million dead, of whom 1.5 million were civilians. Poland, again, by American standards, relatively small country, 8 million dead, of whom 6 million were civilians, and the majority of those civilians Jewish. Japan, one of our major adversaries, 3 million dead, of whom about 1.2 million were civilians. And most of those Japanese civilians killed not at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but in the firebomb raids that preceded the atomic attacks. Germany, 6.5 million dead, of whom about 1.5 million were civilians. Soviet Union, 26 million dead, of whom 16 million were civilians. The United States, 405,399 military dead in all branches of service, and that number includes Army, Army Air Corps, Army Air Force it was called at that time, wasn't an independent arm, Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Merchant Marine, which for these purposes is classified as a belligerent or as a service arm. 405,399 dead. Not a small number, and I don't mean to trivialize it by any means whatsoever. But when you put that into balance with what other countries suffered, you begin to get the picture of how this was not like anybody else's war. And in a conflict in which globally more civilians died than military personnel, the total of civilian deaths in the United States, the continental United States, the 48 states of the so-called continental U.S. that had a star on the flag as of World War II, in those 6 states, the total deaths, civilian deaths attributable to enemy action were exactly 6 people. 6. They all died together, same time, place, on a place called Gerhart Mountain, which is really more of a ridge than a mountain, just outside of a little teeny town in south central Oregon called Bly. Very improbable place for a bit of World War II history to happen. This is a monument that's up there on Gerhart Mountain today, and it tells us that these 6 people were a woman by the name of Elsie Mitchell. She was 26 years old, and with her were 5 children ages 9 to 14. And Mrs. Mitchell was the wife of this man here on the right, Archie Mitchell. He was a pastor in a local church, and they were taking these 5 kids on a Sunday school outing, and they drove up to Gerhart Mountain. The Reverend Mitchell dropped off his wife and the 5 children, and he went to park the vehicle. And when he was parking it, he heard an explosion, so he immediately ran to the sound of the explosion. And as he described it to the investigators later, he found the bodies of his wife and the 5 children laid out like the spokes of a bicycle wheel. And what they reconstructed, what had happened was Mrs. Mitchell and these kids had apparently perturbed in some way something they found in the brush in the side of the mountain there, and it turned out to be a Japanese firebomb. Now, this is a little-known episode of the war, but the Japanese launched about 10,000 of these from a place called 99 Beach near Tokyo, the big island of Japan. The device was a balloon which went in, the balloons were made out of rice paper, pasted with the panels of which were pasted together by potato-based flour. They were taken to the beach, inflated with, I believe, helium, and underneath them was slung a little gondola that held a 3-pound incendiary device, and some of these also had a little dinky anti-personnel weapon, some hand grenades tied together. The idea was to loft these things into the jet stream, send them across the Pacific Ocean. They had no means of internal propulsion whatsoever, a very technologically primitive device. And the idea was that they would land in North America and ignite forest fires all up and down the western side of North America on such a scale that the United States would be compelled to redirect resources to fighting these forest fires and slow down the advance across the Pacific toward the Japanese home islands. And Mrs. Mitchell and these kids had apparently found one of these things that had not yet exploded. They perturbed it, and it did explode, and it killed them. They're the only 6 civilians in the continental U.S. whose deaths are attributable to enemy action in World War II. There's a postscript to this story. Archie Mitchell remarried and went off as a missionary to Vietnam in approximately 1950. And in approximately 1960, he was kidnapped by Viet Cong or some military force and never heard from again. So next time you think you've got a hard life, reflect on Archie Mitchell's life. Okay, let's go back to where the war began for the U.S. at the site of the USS Arizona Memorial. I wanted to make just a couple of brief concluding remarks. So if this is the memorial, the Arizona, as I say, where it began for the U.S. This is what it looks like today. A private organization bought the USS Missouri, the big battleship, on the deck of which the Japanese formally surrendered in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945. The ship was scheduled to be destroyed and sold for scrap, and a private group bought it and refitted it and brought it to Pearl Harbor, and it now has a permanent anchorage right next to the Arizona. And if you go to the Pearl Harbor USS Arizona Memorial today, this is the view you get. And it seems to me this makes a very hairy-chested kind of statement, that you might have started the war, but look what we did, what we brought to bear in way of retaliation. One of the biggest battleships ever built, outmoded technology today to be sure. But the fact that these two things sit right next to each other, the beginning of the war, the end of the war, I think really makes some kind of very robust statement about how the thing how it started and how it ended. So here's the USS Missouri at the Battle of Okinawa, when it was more or less newly commissioned and it was supporting the the amphibious invasion, Army and Marine invasion of Okinawa in April of 1945. This is one of the first places where the Japanese used kamikaze planes and pilots as a way of trying to repel the American invaders. And this is an extraordinary photograph, I think, of a kamikaze plane striking the USS Missouri at the Battle of Okinawa. And it's a little difficult to see unless you really study this, so I've done you the favor of calling it out here. There's the kamikaze plane, its left wing is about to hit the gunwale of the USS Missouri. There's to me, a very moving story about this. If you go to the USS Missouri today, if you've ever visited Hawaii, you can see the spot where the gunwale to this day is got a big dent in it. That's all the damage it did. But the pilot was this young fellow, Ishino Setsuo, the pilot of the plane. He was the only casualty. No American sailors were hurt. And when the plane grazed the deck like that, he'd come down through a sleet storm of anti-aircraft fire. It was miraculous, I suppose, that he got that far, but he did. And when he grazed the plane like that, grazed the ship rather, his plane disintegrated. And it fragmented, and so did his body. And half of his body was scattered all over the deck of the Missouri. The rest of it sank with the plane. And crew members of the Missouri, in the heat of battle and the passion of war, I suppose, you have to understand, were prepared to, accounts differ, either wash his body overboard with fire hoses or mutilate it. And they were progressing to do whatever it was they were going to do. To repeat, the accounts are different about this, but they were handling the body, or what was left of it. And the captain came on the intercom, or the loudspeaker system of the ship, and he said, no. He said, we're going to have a burial for that young warrior tomorrow. So this young fellow's remains were put in a canvas bag with shell casings to weigh it down, and a crew member improvised a Japanese flag and sewed it onto the bag. And the next day, the ship's chaplain committed the body to the sea, and 6 pallbearers let it slide overboard, accompanied by a volley of rifle fire, a proper burial at sea in military terms. There's the burial happening there on the right. There's Captain Callahan in in his fatigues there at the helm. And Callahan said, as the ceremony ended, again on the ship's PA system, he said, "We have treated this young man as a fellow warrior who displayed courage and devotion and who paid the ultimate sacrifice with his life fighting for his country." Now, I've often thought if character is defined as Hemingway and others did it as grace under pressure, that William Callahan, Captain Callahan, was a member of rather tremendous and admirable character. And this, I think, is one of the great, in my view, one of the great moments in American military history when that much respect was shown for an adversary. Okay, one last remembrance, and then I'll conclude. This also comes, this last remembrance, from the deck of the same ship, the USS Missouri, in September 1945, when the Missouri is anchored in Tokyo Bay and accepting the site for the formal Japanese surrender. And I want to share with you a remark that came from the pen of, here's the surrender ceremony. Again, in one of these macho kinds of demonstrations, the people that organized the ceremony rounded up all the tallest American officers and sailors to flank the gangway down which the Japanese had to come, again, as a gesture of intimidation and domination. And here's the Japanese delegation, both diplomats, civilians, and military in their most formal attire. The Americans are all in fatigues. Again, two statements of national character, I suppose, in some way. But the person I want to call your attention to is that fellow right there in the delegation. You see him there, and here he's highlighted. His name was Toshikazu Kaze. He was a young Japanese diplomat. He'd been educated at Amherst College in the United States. And he stands there in this scenario very stiffly on the Missouri's deck and trying to swallow his humiliation and anguish, one imagines, as he witnessed his superiors put their signatures to the surrender document under the eyes of the victors, Douglas MacArthur in particular. So Kaza heard Douglas MacArthur give a little speech in which MacArthur said the following. He said, "I hope that from this solemn occasion, a better world shall emerge, a world founded on faith and understanding." And Kaza later wrote a book called Journey to the Missouri, in which he said the following. He said, "Hearing General MacArthur, I wondered whether it would have been possible for us, had we been victorious, to embrace the vanquished with a similar magnanimity." Now, again, something worth reflecting on, and that is a topic for another day, but in that moment of supreme military victory, unconditional surrender, and truly enormous hegemonic power over the international system, arguably the United States did believe with a degree of magnanimity that is unusual in historical annals, but was highly consequential for the world we've inhabited ever since. So I started with Winston Churchill, that famous, to me, sentence about the United States stand at this moment at the summit of the world. Let me conclude by reading you the next two sentences in that same speech of Churchill's from August 15th, 1945. So he said, "The United States stand at this moment at the summit of the world. I rejoice that this should be so. Let them act up to the level of their power and their responsibility, not for themselves alone, but for others, for all men in all lands, and then a brighter day may dawn upon human history." Arguably, it did. Whether that dawn is still dawning or day is still dawning is another question. But I think that the United States followed a foreign policy in the immediate post-war decades that does have some quite remarkable and admirable aspects to it, and that's how the United States acted when it was deposited at the summit of the world in 1945. Thank you. So I've gone a little bit overtime, I'm afraid, but I'm hoping that your protocols will allow for some questions. And there are microphones, and I think I am instructed to ask you if you're going to pose a question to wait until you get the microphone. I don't see the microphones. Are they? Oh, yeah, they're there. Okay, sorry. So since I can't see you very well, thanks to the lighting, I'm going to let the people with the microphones identify who's going to ask the question.
Sorry, is maybe you pass it down.
Excuse me, will you pass that down?
Of course.
Thank you.
Hello. I'm back here, if you
Oh, I
can't see me.
Okay, thanks.
So my question is, do you think the current state of affairs, including climate change, presents an equally dangerous and incredible feat for people of my age to overcome? Likewise, our country saw the threat of Nazi Germany fascism. So,
Well, in some ways, if I understand your question about the comparability between the challenge that World War II posed and climate change poses, am I on the right track? Did I understand? Yeah. In some ways, I would argue that your generation has a tougher job because the effects of climate change aren't nearly as dramatic as the Pearl Harbor attack or the invasion of Poland or the invasion of China. They're incremental, long-term, cumulative. It's a slow-motion train wreck, not a great dramatic catastrophe. So marshaling the political will, not just in a single society, but all over the planet, since this is a environmental issue that doesn't know political borders. Mobilizing the political will in several countries, especially the big, powerful industrial countries, to take meaningful action about something the real damage of which is way off in the future somewhere, is an enormously challenging proposition. And frankly, I much admired all the demonstrations that happened in the last few days around the world, and mostly young people, as a matter of fact. But again, to be candid with you, I'm just really skeptical that there exists yet the kind of leadership and deep political will to really take on a problem of this nature. So I pray about it every night.
Here's one. I don't have a clearly formulated question. It's just when that general said this pilot was courageous and a warrior, a hero in his own way, I compare that with last 20 years that I've paid attention. It seems like every time somebody tries to attack the U.S., they are called cowards. Is it just the politicians and the military people recognize that it's not just cowardly to attack another institution?
Well, it's in the long and sorry history of human conflict, it's not unusual whatsoever for anybody to call their adversary cowards, and a lot of worse things than that, as a matter of fact. So we have to make some allowance for just the deep imperfections of human nature. That's just it's in our DNA, I think, to demonize our adversaries. I personally don't think that forms of unconventional warfare like suicide bombing and so on, they're pretty god-awful. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing to admire in it, but I don't think it's cowardly. I don't think that's a proper way to describe it. It takes some kind of, maybe fanatical or not, but some kind of deep commitment to the cause, to sacrifice your life for this political purpose. But you remind me of something else. That Captain Callahan's gesture of respect for that young dead Japanese pilot is not the only case of that kind of grace. There's another one I've come across not too long ago, where the commander of an American cruiser, I think it was, or maybe a battleship, the USS Texas, during the Spanish-American War, the American fleet posted itself off the mouth of Santiago Harbor in Cuba. And for reasons that yet are to be explained adequately, the Spanish fleet steamed out single file to certain annihilation by the American fleet, which was positioned just to pick them off one by one. If you've ever seen Santiago Harbor, you know what I'm talking about. It's not much wider than this room. And it's just the Spanish ships simply could not effectively fire against the American fleet. So the USS Texas hit this is 1898, hit a Spanish ship called the Vizcaya and blew it to smithereens, and it was all fire and smoke and going down. And the American sailors on board the Texas started cheering. And their captain came on whatever passed for the intercom or public address system on that battleship at that time. And he said, "Don't cheer, men. Those poor devils are dying." again, respect for one's adversary as fellow human beings and people who maybe have a certain courageous character. I think it's hard to muster that kind of attitude in the heat of battle, but occasionally it happens.
I'm wondering if you would address the situation that existed before the war. My dad was called up in 1940 to take on the training of Air Force mechanics. And there was a fairly significant mobilization effort taking place before war had been declared, before acts in Congress had taken place to actually authorize spending for a war effort. Can you talk about the I guess we'd call it off the books war planning activity that was taking place in order to position the country so that the war could actually be fought?
Yeah, good point. I suppose off the books is a okay way to describe it. It wasn't entirely off the books, but there were appropriations that were shifted from other public works projects into the production of ships and airplanes in particular. Most of those were intended to be given or loaned, lend-lease, to the British and the French in particular. One of them crashed with a French pilot, and that exposed the fact that these things were, some of them were being shipped to France. That stopped that for a while. And of course, France leaves the war in June of 1940, so that surely stopped. But yeah, there was a fair little bit of large-scale, the construction of large-scale weapon systems like strategic bombers and capital ships in the Navy. But again, compared to what happens when we go public, you might say, and formally enter the war, it's a hill of beans. Just doesn't amount to much. But these weapon systems, that's kind of the generic title for something like a strategic bomber or an aircraft carrier, you can't just conjure them into being in the next couple of weekends. It takes years to build one of these things. And to build several of them is some kind of economic and production and engineering miracle, as it was called at the time. So yeah, a lot of the engineering work and the planning had gone on in the 1930s. The United States Army Air Force had made this decision, and the other military branches agree that in the event of a future conflict, we will make our biggest investment in the strategic air arm. So a lot of the necessary work before you actually get onto the factory floor had been done well before 1940 even. Here's another interesting reflection on this that you just prompted. Military planners and thinkers around the world read Giulio Douhet's book, published in 1922. Despite the French sound to his name, he was Italian, and he was trying to think through how, if there's another conflict, and there will be, of course, how can we avoid fighting in a way that led to the kind of stalemate and bloodshed of trench warfare in World War I? And that's how he started thinking about strategic bombing, using this new technology in this revolutionizing way, he thought. So people read this around the world. Only 2 countries decided that they would build their entire military establishment around the principal component of the strategic air arm. It's the United States and Great Britain. The Germans bombed civilian targets, and so the Japanese for that matter, and so the Russians, but they never built a strategic air arm on the scale that the Brits and the Americans did. In Britain, the British technology wasn't as good as the Americans, and the early stages of the war, British bombing of German targets in Europe inflicted very heavy casualties on the British Royal Air Force. So much so that they figured they couldn't keep it up. The attrition rates were so great that they could predict the date beyond which they simply wouldn't have the planes or the aircraft any longer. So they resorted to something that they euphemistically called area bombing. So instead of trying to bomb precision targets in daylight, they bombed just big urban areas at nighttime and just laid the bombs down wherever they could, where they thought there was a target underneath, but no precision to it. There were protests against this technique in Britain itself during the war. Not many, and they were kind of muffled, and you can imagine it's hard to criticize your own government and military in the midst of a war, but there were some of these. And after the war, all the British commanders who were commanders of major units like Montgomery and so on were elevated to the peerage. They were made lords, with the exception of the head of the bomber force. His name was Arthur Harris, also known as Bomber Harris. He was knighted, but he was never elevated to the peerage, and that's long been thought as some kind of a statement of Britain's bad conscience about waging the strategic bombing campaign that way. There's nothing quite comparable in the American case. Again, I'm kind of rambling here, but it's a point worth making, I think. Some of you may have seen that Earl Morris film, Fog of War, about Robert McNamara. It's mostly about Vietnam, of course, but little known, many people. McNamara was on the staff of Curtis LeMay out there in the Mariana Islands in World War II, and he had the job of trying to perfect the technique of firebomb raids on Japanese cities. So every after-action report, McNamara and his team would analyze it and try to figure out, is there a better mix of high explosive and incendiary bombs, a better pattern of delivering the weapons, a better altitude to approach from, and so on, to inflict maximum damage on these Japanese cities. And the firebombs killed something, the firebomb raids killed something in the range of 800,000 Japanese. So in that film, there's a moment when, those of you who've seen it will remember, where McNamara recounts a conversation that he had with Curtis LeMay in the Marianas during the war, in which LeMay, a person not known for his moral scruple, he's the guy that said we'll bomb the Vietnamese back to the Stone Age. LeMay tells McNamara, as McNamara recounts it, he looked at me and he said, "McNamara, if we lose this war, you and I will be tried as war criminals. Because there is nothing in the rules of war that justifies what we're doing. We're deliberately targeting civilians, and we're inflicting mass casualties on civilian targets down there with this firebombing campaign." And as I remember it, McNamara leans into the camera and he says, he was right. There was no justification for what we were doing. So again, in our cultural memory or scholarly discourse about it maybe, there's a lot of discussion about the legitimacy, the morality of the atomic bombs. That's a big topic. People still argue about that. I've long thought that argument is a right argument focused on the wrong topic, because the real subject isn't the atomic bombs. They were just a more efficient way of killing civilians in a hurry. The real moral threshold is crossed in November of 1944, when the United States decides to go ahead with these systematic firebomb raids against Japanese cities, and that we accept, the people at that time, accept thereby the legitimacy of deliberately targeting civilians. That's where the moral argument should have been focused. So on this dreary note, maybe one more? Yes, sir.
That was exactly what I wanted to ask you about. There's not been much said about the morality of...
Oh, hold on, we need a microphone.
Thank you for your excellent talk and for your book. That's what I was going to ask you about. We shy away, at least people my age and older perhaps I'm generalizing too much, of talking about the morality of the firebombing of the civilians and the morality of what we did in bombing Dresden. It was not needed, and we just bombed the hell out of Dresden. Do you think perhaps the morality argument goes back to World War I, when we decided to match our enemies in Europe by the use of poison gas?
Well, the Americans did not use much gas. In fact, maybe none. I actually don't know for sure, but that was not a principal piece of the American arsenal. In Dresden, we could have an argument about Dresden. That's mostly a British operation. But there's another incident in Berlin in February of 1945, when the Americans had prided themselves up to that point of only doing precision raids, daylight raids, using the Norden bomb site, only hitting strategic, economic, and high-value military targets, unlike the Brits, who were doing this random, very destructive so-called area bombing. But in February of 1945, the air people came to Eisenhower, and they said that Germans are on the point of surrender, which was largely true. It's just 3 months away. And if we deliver one crushing blow to their capital from the air and kill a lot of civilians, that'll do it. That'll put them over the edge and they'll surrender. So Eisenhower says okay to this and mounts a raid on Berlin that has no purpose other than killing as many civilians as possible by way of forcing the Germans to surrender. And we think that killed 25,000 German civilians in one night. So I believe that's even more than Dresden. So, again, good argument to have, but maybe Dresden isn't the proper focus. So again, thank you all very much for attending.